On August 2, 216 BC, the sun was just beginning to rise over the plains of Apulia in southern Italy. Yet, the air was already unbearably hot. 80,000 warriors marched in flawless ranks, their sandals kicking up clouds of dust that obscured the horizon. These were the Roman legions, the mightiest army the world had ever seen. Never before had the Republic gathered so many soldiers in one place, and never before had it been so confident of victory. The two consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paullus and Gaius Terentius Varro, led their troops, knowing for certain that on this day they would inscribe the most brilliant chapter in Roman history. Their objective was simple: find the accursed Barca, the Carthaginian who dared to invade Italy, and wipe him from the face of the earth. The numbers were on their side. They outnumbered the enemy nearly 2 to 1. The arithmetic of war was clear and unforgiving. More soldiers meant more swords, more shields, more power. Rome could not lose. It was mathematically impossible. The legionaries advanced with their legendary discipline, through which they had conquered the entire Italian peninsula. Among them were veterans seasoned in hundreds of battles, young patricians yearning for glory, plebeians fighting for honor and for Rome. All of them anticipated the final annihilation of the African invader, and already pictured in their minds a triumphant parade in Rome, laurel wreaths, honors from the Senate. None of them suspected that they were marching to their doom, because a few kilometers away, in the small settlement of Cannae by the Alps River, a 30-year-old military genius awaited them. Hannibal Barca had chosen this battlefield with surgical precision. He had studied the Romans for years, knew their arrogance, their tactics, every detail of their combat, and he had devised something no one before him had ever attempted: a perfect, deadly tactical trap that would turn the Romans' numerical superiority into their own death sentence. As the legions approached, convinced of their inevitable victory, Hannibal watched from a hill. He did not smile. It was unnecessary. He knew exactly what would happen in the next 8 hours. He would turn this field into the greatest slaughter of ancient history. He would leave an unhealing scar in Rome's memory. He would prove that a smaller army, led by a genius, could destroy a force twice its size. A Roman trumpet blast sounded in the distance. The battle was about to begin, but it would not be a battle. It would be a massacre. To understand why 80,000 Roman soldiers marched to their doom on that August day in 216 BC, we must go back in time. We must understand the primal hatred that brought these two Mediterranean giants to the brink of an abyss, because this battle did not arise out of nowhere. It was the bloody culmination of a rivalry that had begun decades earlier, when two empires clashed for control of the known world: Rome and Carthage. The former, a militaristic republic forged in the iron of legionary discipline; the latter, a Phoenician commercial power built on the gold of Mediterranean trade. For years, these two civilizations coexisted peacefully, each expanding, each developing, each watching the growing power of the other with suspicion. But peace had an expiration date. The trigger was Sicily, a strategic island that both powers craved. In 264 BC, the First Punic War erupted. For 23 brutal years, Romans and Carthaginians annihilated each other on land and sea. Rome ultimately emerged victorious, stripping Carthage not only of Sicily but also of Corsica and Sardinia. However, victory has its price, and Rome humiliated Carthage with ruinous economic reparations. The Carthaginians swallowed their pride, signed the peace, and retreated to lick their wounds. But in Carthage, amidst the bitterness of defeat, there was a man who would never forgive. His name was Hannibal Barca, Carthage's most outstanding general. Hamilcar had fought with honor in the First Punic War and now, defeated but not broken, planned revenge. He had a 9-year-old son named Hannibal. Legend has it that Hamilcar led young Hannibal to an altar and made him swear to the gods that he would never be Rome's friend. A child's oath would become the meaning of his entire life. Hamilcar went to Spain, to the rich lands of the Iberian Peninsula, and began to rebuild Carthaginian power. He created a new empire, conquered tribes, amassed wealth from silver mines. His goal was clear: to prepare revenge against Rome. When Hamilcar died in battle, his work was continued by his son-in-law, Hasdrubal. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the Carthaginian army in Spain acclaimed their new commander by acclamation. He was 26 years old. His name was Hannibal Barca. The child who had sworn to hate Rome now commanded Carthage's most powerful army, and was ready to fulfill his oath in 218 BC. What Rome considered unforgivable arrogance led to Hannibal's siege and capture of Saguntum, a Roman ally. The Romans demanded that Carthage hand over Hannibal for punishment. When Carthage refused, the Second Punic War began. However, Hannibal did not wait for the Roman legions to arrive. He did something unprecedented, something no one before him had managed, something everyone considered impossible. He decided to invade Italy not by sea, where the Roman navy dominated, but by land, crossing the Pyrenees, traversing hostile Gaul, and, most incredibly, crossing the Alps with an army of about 50,000 men and 37 war elephants. It was autumn, the mountains were covered in snow, Gallic tribes attacked relentlessly, and the Alpine passes claimed thousands of lives. But Hannibal did not stop. He finally descended into the plains of northern Italy, with only 20,000 men, less than half his original army. But he was in Italy, in the very heart of Roman power. What followed was a series of Carthaginian victories that struck Rome with terror. On the Trebia River, Hannibal crushed the legions of consul Sempronius with a brilliant ambush tactic. At Lake Trasimene, he created a perfect trap, destroying an entire Roman army of 15,000 men in one of history's deadliest ambushes. Panic gripped Rome. Its armies continued to suffer defeat. Its generals could not understand how a numerically inferior invading army could repeatedly destroy them. The answer was simple and terrifying. Hannibal Barca was no ordinary general. He was a military genius. And so, in the summer of 216 BC, Rome made a desperate decision to assemble the largest army in its history and crush Hannibal once and for all. 80,000 men. Absolute numerical superiority. Blind confidence in victory. They do not know that Hannibal awaits them at Cannae. They do not know that he has devised the most perfect trap ever conceived. They do not know that in a few hours, their numerical superiority will become their deadliest curse. Every great battle is decided not only by the soldiers who fight in it, but by the men who command them. And at Cannae, the fate of over 100,000 men rests on the shoulders of a few commanders whose decisions, characters, and rivalries will determine who survives and who perishes. To understand these men is to understand the battle, because Cannae was not just a clash of armies. It was a duel of minds, of military philosophies between genius and arrogance. On the Roman side, the Republic entrusted its destiny to two consuls who could not have been more different. Lucius Aemilius Paullus, a seasoned aristocrat, a veteran of military campaigns who understood the danger Hannibal represented. He had studied Rome's previous defeats. He knew the Carthaginian was dangerous, unpredictable, deadly. Paullus favored a cautious strategy, waiting for the opportune moment. He was the kind of commander who understood that patience could save lives. But Paullus did not command alone. Leadership was shared with Gaius Terentius Varro, a man who was his complete opposite. Varro was a populist, a politician who had reached the consulship by promising a swift victory. He represented the plebeians eager to crush the African invader. Varro believed in direct action, brute force, the overwhelming power of the legions. To him, Paulus's caution was cowardice. To him, 80,000 Roman soldiers were invincible. And here lay the fatal problem. Rome, in its dual consular system, decided that Paullus and Varro would command the army alternately. One day, one commanded, the next day the other. This system was designed to prevent too much power from concentrating in one man's hands. But in war, unity of command is crucial, and at Cannae, this division would prove catastrophic. The two consuls argued constantly. Paullus wanted to avoid battle on unfavorable terrain. Varro wanted to attack immediately. The tension between them was palpable, and the troops felt it. Under the command of Paullus and Varro were 80,000 men. This was the largest army ever assembled by Rome. 8 full legions of heavy infantry, the steel core of Rome. Each legionary carried his gladius, his short sword, deadly in close combat, his pilum to throw before the clash, his large rectangular shield, his armor. They were professionals, trained to fight in compact formations, advancing like an unstoppable killing machine. Alongside them were thousands of Italian allies, auxiliary troops from cities subordinate to Rome, and 4,000 cavalrymen, the weakest part of the Roman army. Rome had never been strong in cavalry. Romans were infantrymen. They believed in the power of the foot legionary, not the mobility of horsemen. This would be their greatest mistake. But the Romans did not know it yet. They marched towards Cannae. convinced that numbers would decide the outcome of the battle. 80,000 against 40,000 was simple arithmetic guaranteeing victory. On the other side of the field, waiting with almost supernatural calm, stood the man who had terrorized Italy for 2 years. Hannibal Barca was 30 years old. He had reached the peak of his military genius. He had dedicated his entire life to preparing for this moment. His father had trained him in the art of war from childhood. He had commanded troops since he was 20. He knew the Romans intimately, had studied their every battle. He understood their doctrine, frontal assault with massive infantry. He understood their mindset, absolute confidence in numerical superiority, and he had built his strategy to exploit these characteristics. Hannibal's army was fundamentally different from Rome's. It was not a homogeneous force. It was a multinational mosaic of warriors from across the western Mediterranean. He had battle-hardened African heavy infantry, loyal to the death. He had Iberians from Spain, fierce warriors with their characteristic falcatas. He had Gauls from Cisalpine Gaul, fair-haired giants eager for revenge against Rome. He had Numidian horsemen from North Africa, the best light cavalry in the world, and he had heavy Iberian and Gallic cavalry, capable of crushing any enemy formation. A total of about 40 to 50,000 men, almost half the enemy's numbers. But Hannibal saw no disadvantage in this. He saw an opportunity, because his true advantage was not in numbers. It was in cavalry. While Rome could muster barely 4,000 mediocre horsemen, Hannibal had 10,000 of the world's best horsemen, and in his brilliant mind, he had already envisioned exactly how to use them. Hannibal did not fight like the Romans. He did not believe in head-on clashes of massive infantry. He believed in maneuver and deception, in turning the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. He had studied the great commanders of the past. He was familiar with the tactic of envelopment, and he was about to execute the greatest of all time. Beside Hannibal was his brother Hasdrubal, commanding the heavy cavalry, a fearsome warrior. There was Maharbal, leader of the Numidian horsemen, swift as the wind. There was Gannon, commander of the veteran African infantry. These were men who trusted Hannibal blindly and would execute his plan without hesitation. The difference between the two sides was fundamental. Rome had more soldiers but two disagreeing commanders. Carthage had fewer soldiers but a unified genius at the helm. Rome trusted brute force. Hannibal trusted strategy. Rome believed numbers decided everything. Hannibal knew that brains decided everything. The question that would echo through the centuries was, could a brilliant commander with an inferior army defeat a force twice its size? In a few hours, Cannae would answer that question in blood. Now, Hannibal's genius found its full expression. Because victory in battle is not just about having more soldiers or better weapons. It is about understanding the terrain, knowing your enemy better than he knows himself, creating the ideal conditions for victory. Before a single arrow was loosed, Hannibal Barca would demonstrate why he is considered one of the greatest military geniuses of all time, and his plan was as brilliant as it was horrifying. First, the terrain. As the Romans marched south, seeking a decisive confrontation, Hannibal had already chosen the battlefield. This was no coincidence. It was pure calculation. He chose the plains of Cannae, near the Alpheus River. It was flat terrain, ideal for cavalry maneuvers. And here was the first advantage. Hannibal had a threefold superiority in cavalry. The Romans had 4,000 horsemen. He had 10,000 on this open ground. This difference would be deadly. But that was not all. Hannibal positioned his army so that the Alpheus River was at his back and to his left. This served two crucial purposes. Firstly, it protected his left flank, preventing the Romans from outflanking him on that side. Secondly, his army was positioned so that the morning sun would be at his back, directly into the eyes of the Romans as they advanced, and a southeastern wind would blow dust and sand directly into the Romans' faces. Every detail mattered. Every natural element became a weapon. Now for the most brilliant part, the tactical formation. Hannibal was about to do something that had never been attempted on such a scale. He deliberately used a weak center as bait. Traditionally, armies placed their best infantry in the center as their main force. Hannibal did the opposite. In the center of his line, he placed his Gallic and Iberian troops. They were good warriors, but not his best units, and he ordered them to form a slightly convex line, curved forward like a bow. This formation was designed to retreat. Yes, you read that right. Hannibal's center was intended to yield to the Roman attack. The Gauls and Iberians had clear orders. As the Romans attacked, they were to retreat slowly, maintaining their formation. Let the Romans advance. Let them push deeper and deeper, becoming the bait that lured the prey into a trap. But on the flanks, that's where the true power lay. On either side of the weak center, slightly withdrawn, Hannibal placed his veteran African infantry. These were the best soldiers in his army, battle-hardened in countless engagements. They were disciplined and deadly. Many wore captured Roman armor and weapons, taken in previous battles. They were equipped like legionaries, but fought with Carthaginian flexibility. They were ordered to wait. There would be no frontal assault. They would await the perfect moment. On the far flanks, Hannibal positioned his cavalry. On the right flank, by the river, he placed Hasdrubal with 6,000 to 7,000 heavy Iberian and Gallic cavalrymen, great warriors on powerful armored horses with long lances. Their mission was clear: destroy the Roman cavalry on this flank as quickly as possible. On the left flank, he placed the Numidian cavalry, 3,000 to 4,000 strong. These were light cavalry, fast, maneuverable, experts in skirmishing. Their role was to engage the Roman allied cavalry, distract it, and prevent it from interfering with the main battle. The geometry of death was complete. It was a crescent shape with a weak center protruding forward and strong, slightly withdrawn flanks. It looked vulnerable. It seemed as though the center could be easily broken. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted the Romans to think, because the full plan was devilishly simple and required perfect coordination. Phase 1. The Romans attacked the center, as they always do. The Gallic-Iberian center would retreat slowly, drawing them inward. The crescent would invert, forming a concave shape, swallowing the Roman mass. Phase 2. While this is happening, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry would destroy the Roman cavalry on the right flank. Once that was done, instead of pursuing the fleeing riders, Hasdrubal would ride around the entire Carthaginian line and attack the Roman allied cavalry on the other flank, crushing it between his charge and the Numidians. Phase 3. Once all Roman cavalry was destroyed or routed, Hasdrubal and the Numidians would attack the rear of the Roman infantry, which by then would be fully engaged in the center, pushing forward, believing they were winning. Phase 4. At the precise moment the Romans were most stretched and disorganized by their own advance, the veteran African infantry on both flanks would turn 90 degrees and attack the open flanks of the Roman mass. Phase 5. The Romans would be completely surrounded. Cavalry attacking from the rear, African infantry attacking the flanks, Gauls and Iberians pressing from the front. 80,000 men, compressed into an ever-shrinking space, unable to maneuver, unable to use their numerical superiority, would be systematically annihilated. It was a double envelopment, the perfect pincers. Military men call it the perfect battle, but the genius of this plan lay elsewhere. Hannibal had studied Roman psychology. He knew they trusted their infantry blindly. He knew they despised cavalry. He knew they would attack frontally with all their might. He knew they would see his weak center and think they could break it. Every element of the plan depended on the Romans reacting exactly as he predicted, and he was right about everything. Because Hannibal was not just a brilliant general, he was a psychologist of war. He had turned Rome's strengths into weaknesses. Their mass infantry would become an impediment. In the confinement, their confidence would turn into blind arrogance. Their rigid doctrine would become their death sentence. The trap was set. The pieces were in place. All that remained was for the Romans to walk into it willingly. And they would, because on August 2nd, 216 BC, it was Varro's turn to command the Roman army. The aggressive, impatient consul, who believed 80,000 Romans were invincible, Aemilius Paullus, the cautious one, had warned him. The terrain is unfavorable. We should wait. But Varro did not listen. He saw a smaller Carthaginian army. He saw a center that seemed weak. He saw an easy victory. He ordered the advance. The legions began to march towards their destiny. They did not know that every step took them deeper into the most perfect trap ever devised. They did not know that the waiting genius had calculated every move, every reaction, every mistake they would make. They did not know that in a few hours, the word Cannae would become synonymous with total annihilation. The morning of August 2nd continued. The heat was already unbearable, and now both armies were arrayed, ready for battle. This was the moment when commanders gave their final orders, when soldiers adjusted their armor, when everyone knew that in a few minutes, hell would begin. The Romans arrayed their battle line in their traditional manner, 80,000 men in a compact, deep formation designed to be an unstoppable human battering ram. The legions deployed in the center, packed tightly together. Varro had ordered the ranks to be deeper than usual, compressing the infantry mass into a tighter space. He wanted to concentrate all the striking power in the center. He wanted to break the enemy by relying on pure, brute force. This was Roman doctrine in full: mass, discipline, irresistible frontal pressure. On the flanks, the infantry was very reduced. This was the Roman cavalry on the right flank by the river. On the left, 2,400 Roman citizen cavalrymen were deployed. They were joined by 4,000 cavalrymen from the Italian allies. These forces looked pathetic in comparison to the Carthaginian cavalry. However, Rome had never relied on cavalry. Their faith was in the legionaries, and the Roman soldiers looked forward. They saw the Carthaginian army, clearly outnumbered. They observed the strange, curved formation of the enemy's center. It seemed vulnerable. It seemed a decisive blow would break it. The morale of the Romans was high. They were confident of victory. They did not notice the trap that awaited them. Hannibal completed the deployment of his troops. His formation in the center was strikingly different. The Gauls and Iberians, about 20,000 men, were pushed forward in a convex crescent. These were fierce warriors. However, Hannibal did not expect them to hold out long against the Roman onslaught. They did not need to. They only needed to retreat slowly, maintaining their formation, drawing the enemy masses deeper into the trap. On the flanks of the center, slightly withdrawn, stood the veteran African infantry, forming two dense blocks of 6,000 men each. They stood immobile, disciplined, awaiting the signal, carrying with them captured Roman equipment, intended to confuse the enemy. These men were the key to victory. At the right moment, they would turn and attack the unprotected Roman flanks. On the extreme right flank by the river, Hasdrubal commanded 6,000 to 7,000 heavy Spanish and Gallic cavalrymen. These were magnificent horse warriors, armed with long lances. Their mission was clear and brutal: destroy the Roman cavalry on this flank as quickly as possible. Then they were to ride around the entire battlefield and attack the other flank, the extreme left. But the Numidian horsemen, light and agile, waited to begin harassing the Roman allied cavalry. The trumpet sounds. The light infantry of both sides, javelin throwers, archers, slingers, begin with skirmishes. Missiles fly through the air, men fall. But this is only the prelude. Then, on the right Carthaginian flank by the river, the real horror begins. Hasdrubal throws his heavy cavalry against the 2,400 Roman horsemen. The clash is brutal, furious, desperate. The Spanish and Gallic cavalry is outnumbered. It is better trained, more ferocious. Many dismount and fight hand to hand. The outnumbered Roman cavalry begins to retreat. Consul Paullus, commanding this flank, fights bravely. But early on, he is wounded by a stone thrown by a javelin thrower. The Roman cavalry disintegrates. Some flee, others are annihilated, in a matter of minutes. Hasdrubal has achieved victory on this flank, but he does not pursue the fugitives. He remembers Hannibal's orders, gathers his horsemen, and begins to move around the entire Carthaginian line to the other end of the battlefield. While this is happening, in the center the Roman infantry advances. 80,000 men move forward like an unstoppable machine. The ground trembles beneath their feet. Dust rises in clouds, obscuring the sun. The legionaries march in perfect formation, beating their swords against their shields, shouting, creating a deafening noise intended to strike terror into the enemy. They crash into Hannibal's Gallic Iberian center. The impact is ferocious. Swords hack, shields splinter, men scream, bleed, die. And then, exactly as Hannibal predicted, the Carthaginian center begins to retreat. The Gauls and Iberians give ground, step by step, slowly but in an organized fashion. The convex crescent begins to invert. The Romans see this and believe they are winning. From his command position, Varro sees his infantry pushing the enemy back. He orders the pressure to be increased. More legionaries surge forward. The Roman mass becomes tighter and tighter, pushing deeper and deeper, entering the trap. They do not know it yet, but they have just sealed their fate. Now, the true hell begins, because at Cannae, over the next few hours, 80,000 men will understand the difference between a battle and total annihilation. What will happen will be studied in military academies for over 2,000 years. It is the perfect execution of a perfect plan. It is the day Rome will discover that genius can defeat numerical superiority. The Roman center continues its advance. Legion after legion pushes forward. Hannibal's Gauls and Iberians retreat step by step. It is no longer a convex crescent. The formation has completely changed, forming a deep, concave semicircle. The Romans are being swallowed inward like water into a funnel. But what Varro perceives as victory becomes his undoing. Every meter they advance takes them deeper into the trap. The Roman mass compresses tighter and tighter, the rear ranks pushing the front ones. The soldiers are so tightly packed that they can barely raise their arms to use their swords. The heat is suffocating. The sun shines directly into their eyes. The dust kicked up by thousands of pairs of feet forms clouds, blinding them. The southeastern wind carries sand and grit into their faces. They breathe dust, swallow dust. Their throats burn, but they continue to advance, convinced of victory. Meanwhile, on the Roman left flank, the second act of Hannibal's plan unfolds. Hasdrubal, having destroyed the Roman cavalry on the right flank by the river, has reassembled his 6,000 heavy horsemen and set off around the entire Carthaginian line. It was a daring maneuver, coordinated to perfection. He followed his infantry, raising clouds of dust into the air, and appeared on the opposite flank. The Roman allied cavalry, numbering 4,000 horsemen, continued to engage the agile Numidians. The Roman allies, caught in confusion, tried in vain to pursue these light horsemen, who constantly attacked and retreated. They did not notice Hasdrubal as the heavy Iberian and Gallic cavalry charged into their flank. At this moment the surprise was complete. The allied Roman forces found themselves caught between two forces, the Numidians in front, the heavy cavalry from behind. It was a true massacre. Some tried to resist, but to no avail. Others fled in panic, but the Numidians pursued them, knocking them down, killing them on the run. Within minutes, all Roman and allied cavalry was destroyed or scattered across the battlefield. Rome no longer had any cavalry, only Carthaginians remained. And Hasdrubal regrouped again. He did not pursue the fugitives. He remembered that the plan had a more crucial objective in the center. The Romans had advanced so far that the Carthaginian semicircle was on the verge of breaking. The Gauls and Iberians were exhausted, bleeding, at the limit of their endurance. Some began to think they could hold out no longer. But then came the decisive moment, the signal Hannibal had been waiting for. The Romans were completely stretched. Their formation was disorganized by the advance. Their flanks were exposed to attack. The rear ranks were piling up on the front ones. It was no longer an army, but a compressed mass of men, squeezed into a shrinking space. And then Hannibal gave the order. The experienced African infantry, which had stood immobile all this time, slightly withdrawn on both flanks, began to move. This was 12,000 men, 6,000 on each side. They moved with perfect military precision, turning 90 degrees inward and attacking the Romans, who were completely focused on driving the center forward and did not see the flanking attack. Suddenly, thousands of fresh, rested, enraged African warriors descended upon their unprotected flanks. The Roman formation, so tight in the center, could not react. The soldiers on the flanks tried to turn to meet the new threat, but they were too cramped. There was no room to maneuver. The African infantry cut them down like a knife through butter. They attacked the Roman flanks from both sides simultaneously. It was the perfect pincer movement. And then came the final blow. Hasdrubal and his 10,000 horsemen, having destroyed all enemy cavalry, attacked the rear of the Roman infantry. The legionaries at the rear of the army turned and saw a nightmare. Thousands of horsemen charging directly at them. They tried to form a defensive line. It was impossible. They were too compressed by their own troops advancing forward. The Carthaginian horsemen crashed into the Roman rear like a mace of iron. Lances pierced armor. Horses trampled men with their hooves. It was total chaos. In minutes, the situation for the Romans had transformed from one of impending victory to utter nightmare. They were attacked from four sides. Gauls and Iberians pressed from the front. African infantry attacked both flanks. Cavalry destroyed the rear. And worse, they were so tightly packed that they could not use their weapons effectively. A legionary needs space to wield his short sword. He needs to move, turn, strike. But there were so many men in such a limited space that they could barely breathe. They crushed each other, shields piled up, swords got stuck. Many could not even raise their arms. The encirclement tightened. 80,000 men found themselves trapped in a diminishing space. The Romans finally realized they were not winning. They were being killed. Panic ensued. Soldiers on the outer edge of the encirclement tried to break through the Carthaginian lines. Some succeeded and fled in terror across the plains. Most did not. They were trapped in the mass. The heat was unbearable. The August sun beat down vertically on men in metal armor. The temperature must have been around 40 degrees Celsius. Legionaries and heavy equipment were cooking alive inside their armor. Some died of heatstroke before a sword touched them. Thirst was agonizing. No water, no salvation. And the Carthaginians continued to tighten the ring. The African infantry advanced, slowly squeezing the flanks. The cavalry continued to attack the rear, pushing the Romans forward toward the center of the encirclement. The space narrowed. The Romans were so tightly packed that when a man fell wounded, he could not fall to the ground but remained standing, supported by the surrounding bodies, until he died standing. It was a vision of hell. 80,000 men compressed with no room to move. They were systematically being slaughtered. Carthaginian swords hacked from all sides. The Romans could not defend themselves, could barely see through the dust, blood, and sweat that blinded them. They screamed, cursed, begged for mercy. Consul Lucius Paullus, wounded from the start of the battle, fought to the end, refusing offers of escape, remaining with his men, dying as a Roman, standing with his sword in his hand, surrounded by enemies. On the battlefield, his body falls atop hundreds of others. The other consul, the one who arrogantly ordered this battle to begin, miraculously escapes with a handful of horsemen. He manages to pull away from the field before the encirclement closes completely. He will survive, but he will bear the shame of this defeat for the rest of his life. The slaughter continues for several more hours. It is no longer a battle, but rather a true mass execution. The Carthaginians methodically and systematically destroy the Romans one by one. The legionaries try to surrender. Some Carthaginians take prisoners, but most refuse. The hatred is too strong, the thirst for revenge too great. The Romans had plundered Carthaginian lands for years, and now it was time for payback. The day draws to a close, the sun begins to set, but the killing does not stop. Groups of Romans try to form small defensive squares. They are surrounded and destroyed. Some try to pretend to be dead, falling among the corpses. Many die crushed by their own comrades falling on top of them. Finally, with the setting of the sun, Roman resistance collapses completely. The last organized groups are broken. Thousands manage to escape, breaking through the Carthaginian lines, taking advantage of the confusion and the approaching darkness, but most are not so lucky. As night falls over the plains of Cannae, the battlefield is a spectacle no one will forget. Kilometers of ground littered with corpses, mountains of piled bodies, rivers of blood soaking the dry earth, the air thick with the smell of death, sweat, and fear. On the morning of that day, 80,000 men marched to Cannae. In the end, only about 10,000 will survive. 70,000 killed or dying on the field. This is Rome's worst military defeat, and the bloodiest day in the history of the ancient world. When the sun rises over the plains of Cannae the next day, the world will have changed forever. The battlefield is an apocalyptic spectacle. Corpses as far as the eye can see. 70,000 dead. Some historians will give figures from 50,000 to 60,000. Others say 70,000, with precise data lost in the mists of time. But one thing is undeniable. This was one of the greatest single-day massacres in human history at that time. To grasp the scale, imagine 15 to 20% of all Roman male citizens between the ages of 18 and 50 died at Cannae in one day. Rome lost a third of its adult military population. 80 senators fell, hundreds of tribunes, experienced officers, commanders. An entire generation of Roman elites lay in the mud of Cannae. Carthaginian losses were disproportionately small. Hannibal lost between 6,000 and 8,000 men, mostly Gauls and Iberians from the center, who bore the brunt of the Roman attack. But compared to the Roman losses, it is almost nothing. The loss ratio is approximately 10 to 1, perhaps more. It is difficult to find another battle in history with such an absolute imbalance. In addition to the dead, 10,000 Romans were taken prisoner. Hannibal offers to return them to Rome for ransom. The Roman Senate, showing a severity that would define its character, refuses. The Roman prisoners remain in Carthaginian hands. The wounded who cannot walk are executed. It is a brutal message. Rome does not negotiate. Rome does not surrender, even for its sons. When the news of Cannae reaches Rome, panic grips the city. There are no defenses, no army. All are dead or scattered. The city gates are closed, and a national mourning is declared. But, to everyone's surprise, the Senate does not capitulate. They do something extraordinary. They forbid the use of the word peace and declare a general mobilization, calling for slaves to fight, something unprecedented, even temporarily sanctioning human sacrifice to appease the gods, according to some sources, a practice Rome generally disdained. The city is terrified but not broken. And here, at this critical moment, Hannibal makes the greatest mistake of his career. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, urges him to march on Rome immediately. Hannibal's words would become famous in military history. "You know how to win, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use victory. Give me the cavalry, and in 5 days, I will dine on the capital." But Hannibal refuses. His reasons are understandable. His army is exhausted. He has no siege engines to storm the walls. Rome is a fortress. He needs time to solidify alliances. He decides to wait. It is this mistake that will cost him the war. Because Rome, terrified but not defeated, uses this time to rebuild. It raises new armies, changes its strategy. Instead of engaging Hannibal directly, they adopt the Fabian strategy, named after dictator Fabius Maximus. Attrition, harassment, cutting supply lines. Never again will Rome allow Hannibal to draw it into another pitched battle. The window of opportunity closes. Hannibal won the most perfect battle in history, but he lost the war. Cannae is not just a battle. It is an eternal lesson written in blood, studied in military academies around the world for over 2,000 years. Commanders of all eras will analyze every move, every decision, every detail of what Hannibal did on that August day, because Cannae embodies the absolute art of war, the perfect battle of annihilation, executed by Hannibal. The double envelopment becomes the cherished dream of any military strategist. The perfect pincers, allowing one to completely surround the enemy, cut off escape routes, compress, and systematically destroy, has inspired commanders from Roman times to modern strategists. All have sought to understand and replicate this model. In the 19th century, Russian General Alfred von Schlieffen studied Cannae closely, creating the famous Schlieffen Plan for World War I, based on the exact same principle, a massive envelopment of the French army. He sought to create his own Cannae. In France, the plan almost succeeded but did not achieve perfection. History is full of examples of commanders who tried to become Hannibal and failed, because Hannibal's actions required more than just tactical knowledge. It required genius, a deep understanding of the enemy, perfect coordination of all units, absolute precision in the role played by each soldier, and the ability of the plan to work even against a 2-to-1 enemy superiority. During the Persian Gulf War in 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf studied Cannae before developing a strategy against the Iraqi army, using similar principles of envelopment, flanking attacks, cutting off retreat routes. His campaign was devastatingly effective, and when asked about his sources of inspiration, he mentioned Hannibal and Cannae. Beyond pure military tactics, Cannae offers profound lessons. Numbers are not everything. Arrogance can be fatal, and underestimating the enemy is deadly. A brilliant leader can change the course of history. The Romans learned these lessons in the harshest way possible. They would never again rely blindly on numerical superiority, never again ignore the importance of cavalry. They developed a new military doctrine, studied their enemies carefully, and became more flexible and adaptable. And, paradoxically, Cannae made Rome stronger. The defeat almost destroyed them, but they refused to surrender. It was this resilience, this absolute refusal to capitulate even after the most terrible defeat in history, that defined the Roman character. And ultimately, this resilience prevailed. 13 years after Cannae, a young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, defeated Hannibal using tactics he had learned from Hannibal himself. The student surpassed the master. Rome won the Second Punic War. Carthage was utterly destroyed decades later. And Hannibal, the genius who almost destroyed Rome, ended his days in exile. Pursued, he finally took his own life to avoid Roman captivity. His legacy is contradictory. He won the most perfect battle in history, but he lost the war. He terrorized Rome, but made it invincible. So, What happened after Cannae? How did this story of genius and destruction end? This is the cruelest paradox of the entire Second Punic War. Hannibal won every battle but lost the war, and Rome, having survived the worst defeat in history, ultimately conquered the world. The war continued for another 13 years after Cannae, 13 years of fierce fighting in Italy. Hannibal remained on Italian soil. He could not be expelled or defeated. He won new battles, remaining invincible on the open field. But Rome, demonstrating the resilience that defined its national character, categorically refused to capitulate. It adopted the Fabian strategy, named after the dictator Fabius Maximus, nicknamed Cunctator. The tactic was simple but effective. Avoid pitched battles with Hannibal, harass him constantly, cut his supply lines, attack his allies, slowly wearing him down. It was a war of national-scale guerrilla warfare. Hannibal controlled parts of southern Italy but could never take Rome itself. His Italian allies began to return to Rome, seeing that he could not protect them. Meanwhile, Rome played the long game, opening a second front in Spain, attacking Carthaginian territories there. A young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of a consul who died fighting Hannibal, led these campaigns. Scipio was obsessed with studying Hannibal. He learned his tactics, understood his genius, and used it against Carthage in Spain. Scipio defeated Carthaginian armies, using Hannibal's own tactics against them. He captured Carthaginian colonies, cut off Hannibal's supply lines, and then made a bold move. He invaded Africa. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa and directly threatened Carthage. Panic gripped the city. The Carthaginian Senate made the hardest decision in its history. Recall Hannibal. After 15 years in Italy, after victory, Hannibal had to leave the peninsula and return. To defend his homeland, he had to leave Italy, without ever taking Rome, without achieving ultimate victory. Imagine his disappointment, his bitterness. He had been so close. The final encounter took place in 202 BC at Zama, near Carthage. For the first time in his career, Hannibal faced a commander who had studied him. Scipio used flexible formations, exploited Carthaginian weaknesses, neutralized Hannibal's war elephants, and for the first time in his life, Hannibal was defeated in a pitched battle. This was the end. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were brutal. Carthage had to surrender its entire fleet, pay enormous reparations, and cede all territories except North Africa. It could never again wage war without Rome's consent. It was total humiliation. After the war, Hannibal tried to rebuild Carthage, becoming a magistrate and implementing economic reforms, attempting to heal the wounds. But Rome never forgave him. The Romans pursued him politically and demanded his extradition. Hannibal fled, becoming a refugee. He spent years in exile, offering his military services to other kingdoms opposed to Rome. But Rome always pursued him. Finally, in 183 BC, surrounded by Roman agents in Bithynia, with no escape, Hannibal took poison. His last words, according to legend, were, "Let us free the Romans from their anxiety, for they find it too hard to wait for an old man's death." He died at 64, far from his homeland, defeated but never broken. He passed away, and Carthage itself did not last much longer. In 146 BC, Rome found a pretext for the Third Punic War and besieged Carthage. The city resisted heroically for 3 years, but finally fell. The Romans systematically destroyed every building, killing or enslaving the entire population. According to legend, they sowed salt into the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. Carthage was wiped off the map. A civilization that had challenged Rome ceased to exist. What did Cannae leave us? What do we learn from that bloody day in 216 BC, when 70,000 men died in 8 hours? The lessons are numerous, profound, eternal, and extend far beyond the battlefield. The first, most obvious lesson: numbers are not everything. Rome had 80,000 soldiers, Hannibal 40,000. Arithmetic dictated that Rome should win, but reality crushed arithmetic. Brilliant strategies prove that quality of command can outweigh quantity of troops. A commander who deeply understands the nature of war and knows the enemy better than the enemy knows himself can achieve the impossible. This lesson echoes through the ages. David defeating Goliath is not a romantic myth but a tactical reality when the weak outsmart the strong. Second lesson: arrogance kills. The Romans marched to Cannae confident of victory. Numerical superiority, legendary discipline, mathematical certainty. They did not account for the possibility that the enemy might be smarter. They did not imagine that their own strength would become a weakness. The mass of 80,000 men, considered invincible, became a death trap when compressed into a limited space and unable to use their weapons. Blind arrogance, and in war, blindness is fatal. This lesson repeats in every historical conflict. Armies that consider themselves invincible fall. Third, the most difficult lesson. Know your enemy. Hannibal had studied Rome for years, knew their new military doctrine, knew they would attack frontally, knew their trust in mass infantry, despised cavalry, and built the entire battle around these certainties. He did not improvise. He planned meticulously. Every element of the strategy exploited a specific characteristic of the enemy. This principle of knowing the enemy better than he knows himself is fundamental not only to war but to any human competition, business, sport, politics. In every conflict, understanding reality must come first. The fourth, and best lesson, flexibility conquers rigidity. Rome had a rigid military doctrine that had proven effective in hundreds of battles. Frontal assault, mass infantry, unbreakable discipline. It worked against previous enemies, but when they encountered someone who understood this rigidity and exploited it, it collapsed. Hannibal, on the other hand, was flexible, used multinational troops, different fighting styles, adapted his formations specifically to this enemy, this terrain, this battle. Flexibility is survival. Rigidity is death. Fifth lesson. Perfect coordination multiplies strength. Hannibal's plan required 4 different elements to act at precise moments. Gallic Iberian infantry slowly retreating, heavy cavalry destroying one flank, then attacking another, African infantry waiting for the precise moment when cavalry turned, attacking the flank. If even one element had failed, the entire plan would have collapsed, but it was executed perfectly. This coordination, synchronization, mutual trust between commanders and soldiers transformed a brilliant plan into a devastating reality. In any human organization, the coordination of its parts turns potential into victory. Sixth lesson, perhaps the most important for Rome. Defeat can teach more than victory. Cannae almost destroyed Rome, but it refused to surrender. The Romans learned, changed, developed a new doctrine, avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal, attacked weak points, opened new fronts, and ultimately produced Scipio, a commander who studied Hannibal as deeply as Hannibal had studied Rome. Rome lost the battle but won the war because it learned to survive and transform defeat into education. Seventh lesson. Tactical victory does not guarantee strategic success. Perhaps this is the cruelest lesson of Cannae. Hannibal fought a perfect battle, annihilated the enemy, achieved the dream of any military commander, but did not win the war because he lacked a viable strategic plan to translate tactical victories into ultimate victory. He could not take Rome, could not force it to capitulate. He lacked sufficient support from Carthage. Brilliant victories did not change the fundamental balance of power. This lesson is vital for any protracted conflict. Winning battles is not enough. Strategy is needed to turn victories into the ultimate goal. Eighth lesson. Resilience determines the ultimate victors. Rome survived the worst defeat in its history, losing a third of its adult male population. Allies began to defect. Hannibal controlled parts of Italy, but Rome categorically refused to surrender. They even banned the word peace, raised new armies, and continued the struggle with an unyielding will, a categorical refusal to admit defeat, even when all seemed lost. Ultimately, they won the war. Resilience surpasses genius when genius cannot deliver the final victory. Ninth lesson. The terrain is decisive. Hannibal chose Cannae very carefully. Flat terrain for cavalry, a river protecting a flank, the sun playing to his troops' advantage. Every natural element became a weapon. Commanders who ignore terrain fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Those who use it gain an advantage even before the first arrow is loosed. 10th lesson. Human genius. Individual personalities can change the course of history. Hannibal Barca, a 30-year-old man, devised and executed the most perfect battle ever fought. His mind, his vision of war, and his understanding changed the destiny of civilizations. Great leaders matter, brilliant minds matter. An exceptional individual in the right place at the right time can turn the world upside down. Can this be a monument to human genius for good or for evil?